History as it happens, September 12, 2023. War for the Donbas, war for Ukraine.
In 2013, pro-Western demonstrators in Ukraine began flocking to the streets in what would grow to become the Maidan Revolution.
More than 10,000 people have lost their lives since war broke out in eastern Ukraine back in 2014. Millions have been forced to leave their homes.
Russian troops spreading out throughout the strategic Crimean Peninsula, surrounding Ukrainian bases, ordering their forces off of them so they can occupy them.
America has few economic interests in Ukraine. We recognize the deep and complex history between Russia and Ukraine, but we cannot stand by when the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a nation is flagrantly violated.
Before Russia's full-scale invasion, a separatist war backed by Moscow raged in the eastern Donbas region for 8 years, scarring that Rust Belt with immense destruction. Turning it into a region Ukraine would have been better off without, according to political scientist Alexander Motyl. So what's the point of fighting over its piles of rubble and depopulated villages now? The war isn't simply about the Donbas anymore. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Everything changed on February 24, 2022. This region, which is still a hellhole, but of course it's a highly depopulated hellhole, so given the aggressive designs that Russia has on these territories and on Ukraine more generally, it just doesn't make any sense. Right? It would be suicidal for Ukraine to say, we don't care about these territories. They have to.
In September 2015, in a speech to the UN General Assembly, President Barack Obama chided Russia for seizing Crimea the previous year and for backing separatists in the Donbas, plunging eastern Ukraine into a conflict that would claim more than 10,000 lives before 2022.
Consider Russia's annexation of Crimea and further aggression in eastern Ukraine. America has few economic interests in Ukraine. We recognize the deep and complex history between Russia and Ukraine. But we cannot stand by when the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a nation is flagrantly violated. If that happens without consequence in Ukraine, it could happen to any nation gathered here today. That's the basis of the sanctions that the United States and our partners impose on Russia. It's not a desire to return to a Cold War. Now, within Russia, state-controlled media may describe these events as an example of a resurgent Russia. A view shared, by the way, by a number of U.S. politicians and commentators who have always been deeply skeptical of Russia and seem to be convinced a new Cold War is, in fact, upon us. And yet, look at the results. The Ukrainian people are more interested than ever in aligning with Europe instead of Russia. Sanctions have led to capital flight, a contracting economy, a fall in ruble, and the emigration of more educated Russians. Imagine if instead Russia had engaged in true diplomacy and worked with Ukraine and the international community to ensure its interests were protected.
Well, that same day, before the same UN General Assembly, Vladimir Putin spoke of the importance of peace and the international order, but pointed his finger at those in the West who still subscribe to bloc thinking. First, they continue their policy of expanding NATO, said Putin. What for? The Warsaw Bloc stopped its existence, the Soviet Union collapsed, and nevertheless, NATO continues expanding as well as its military infrastructure. Then they offered the poor Soviet countries, said Putin, a false choice, either to be with the West or the East. Sooner or later, he said, this logic of confrontation was bound to spark a grave geopolitical crisis. We're confident, said Russia's autocrat, that only through full and faithful implementation of the Minsk agreements of February 12, 2015, can we put an end to the bloodshed and find a way out of the deadlock. Ukraine's territorial integrity cannot be ensured by threat of force and force of arms. Well, those are strange remarks considering Russia's role in, violating Ukraine's territory. It was during these years when political scientist Alexander Motyl, a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, and on nationalism, revolutions, empires, and theory, wrote in Foreign Policy magazine that Ukraine should let the Donbas go. The Donbas has consistently supported Ukraine's most retrograde, anti-reformist, anti-European, pro-Russian, and pro-Soviet political forces. It was the Donbas that made Viktor Yanukovych, whose political career was dedicated to bringing Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, president in 2010. It was out of the Donbas that came his corrupt party of regions, wrote Motyl, and it was the Donbas that opposed popular pro-democracy uprisings in 2004 and 2014. Vladimir Putin's occupation of the eastern Donbas effectively disenfranchised its voters. That was bad for the voters, but it enabled pro-democratic forces in unoccupied Ukraine to win the presidency and control of the country's parliament, wrote Motyl. If the eastern Donbas is brought back into Ukraine's fold, many of these changes could be reversed or stalled, and whatever hopes Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has for pursuing more reform would be dashed. So why am I bringing up this old article written in 2019? Well, as you know from listening to recent episodes, the fighting in Ukraine appears more pointless by the day, a World War I-style battle of attrition where gains are measured in yards and paid for in lives by the thousands. Not pointless to Ukrainians, of course. They're trying to liberate occupied parts of their country. But my point is, if Ukraine might have been better off without the Donbas 5 years ago, why fight and die for piles of rubble and depopulated villages? Well, the current war isn't merely for control of the Donbas, not anymore. Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion was and is aimed at subjugating Ukraine, and neither side appears ready to negotiate, even though it can be argued neither side is capable of achieving its military objectives. So in the interest of bringing you an array of diverse viewpoints on the war and the relevant history, Alexander Motyl is a scholar at Rutgers University, Newark, and author of Imperial Ends, The Decay, Collapse, and Revival of Empires. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Trying to describe this war and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has been challenging over the past 18 months. Is it part of a global war pitting autocracy against democracy? Or is it simply a conflict between Russia and Ukraine over a set of circumstances that are unique to these two countries, historical, cultural, religious, linguistic? Where do you fall in all of this?
This is a war about Ukraine. And of course, by extension, it's also obviously a war about Russia. But it's fundamentally about Russian attitudes towards Ukraine, political, cultural, religious, historical, identitarian, if I may use that as an adjective. That is the key. Now, that said, the war obviously has implications for democracy, autocracy, globalization, empire, geopolitics, Eurasia, and the rest of the world. But fundamentally, it's about Russia's attitudes towards Ukraine and Russia's unwillingness. And here I should emphasize, it's a question both of Russia as Russia and of Russia as Putin's Russia. So both these entities express this unwillingness to regard Ukraine as a separate sovereign entity. And this goes back to history. We can talk about that later on. This goes back to culture. And it goes back to a whole bunch of ideological hangups that many Russian elites, including Mr. Putin, of course, still have with regard to their role in the world, and especially their role vis-a-vis Ukraine.
And of course, policymakers, decision makers, ideologues in any country can make this war about something that it isn't, right? You can talk your way or invest your way into making the war more important or more global in its reach than it actually is. You know, some critics of U.S. policy might make that argument, that the U.S., by investing so much in Ukraine, is now committed to Ukraine's survival no matter what, as part of this framing that President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken, for instance, mention all the time. This is a front line against autocrats. Your thoughts on that?
On the one hand, yes, it is a front line against not so much autocrats in plural, but against a particular autocrat named Vladimir Putin. But that's not really the issue. That's an attractive way of framing it, so I understand why people are concerned and why they do it in such a manner, because, of course, we're Democrats, they're autocrats, we're the good guys, he's the bad guy, and it's a question of values and political systems. Well, that's true, but only to a very, I'd say to a certain extent. What makes this conflict far more important than just about Ukraine and its identity and its survival is that Ukraine's continued existence as a sovereign state, or alternatively, the flip side of the coin would be its non-existence as a sovereign state. Both those eventualities, both those outcomes would have extremely important consequences for the stability and security of the West in general and of Europe in particular. So from that point of view, again, as I said, what's driven Russia to invade Ukraine is almost exclusively a particular kind of, let's call it ideology or ideological approach on the part of Russia towards Ukraine. That having been said, the conflict, by virtue of its lasting 18 months and perhaps another 18 months, is no longer just about 2 or 3 provinces in eastern and southern Ukraine. That's what it was arguably 2-3 years ago. Now it's about the existence of a state, and more importantly, is about the possibility that Putin's Russia will continue with its imperial agenda, not just in Ukraine, but in other places as well. All right, that makes this more than just a local conflict. That makes this of immense importance to the security of Europe, to the security of NATO, and by extension to the security and stability of the United States as well.
Does Russia have that capability, though? I mean, it does have nuclear weapons, but, I mean, we're 18 months into a war. Of course, war's not over. Things can change. Wars of attrition look like nothing's happening until one side cracks, but seems like a stretch, isn't it, to think that Putin would have imperial or could execute imperial ambitions beyond Ukraine, even if he wanted to?
Well, it all depends on the outcome of the war. If Russia loses the war, that's the end of Putin's imperial ambitions. If something in the nature of a stalemate ensues, or alternatively, if Russia happens to win the war, which I think personally is unlikely, but again, provided that the West continues to supply arms to Ukraine. But given those 2 other eventualities, those 2 other possibilities, that would add to the ideological fervor of the regime. And it would certainly be under no compunctions to ruin the economy, destroy its population in order to promote Putin's ideological ambitions. I mean, remember, before the invasion of February 24th, for several months before that, I was always asked by interviewers like yourself, is Putin going to invade? And I would then list 10 reasons why it would be absolutely crazy for him to do so. Each of those reasons has subsequently transpired. Namely, he would galvanize NATO, he would alienate the Ukrainians, he would lose the Ukrainians, he would isolate Russia, he would destroy the Russian economy, he would destroy the Russian population, and so on the list. And despite the fact that this was a completely irrational, arguably idiotic move, one that could actually lead to the collapse of Russia, not just as a regime, not just Putin as president, but Russia as a state, despite the fact that this was all manifestly visible, not just to me, but to a whole score of analysts in December of 21, January and February of 22, as well as Russians, by the way. Despite that fact, he did it. So the Russian leadership has it doesn't have quite the same constraints that we think it should or could or would have. It does things pretty much on its own. Now, the other important point to keep in mind is it's not as if the Russians, if they happen to do well in Ukraine, will then unleash a war against Germany and the United States. If you think of Russian imperial expansion in those terms, then of course it seems totally crazy. Although, mind you, Putin already did something totally crazy. And every few days or every few weeks, some member of the Russian establishment says that a tactical nuclear exchange that would actually be a good thing mind you. So this isn't completely idiotic. What's more likely to happen is that Belarus will be swallowed almost immediately. Northern Kazakhstan, which is populated by a primarily Russian or Russian-speaking population, could easily be attacked by the Russians. And again, it wouldn't require any fundamental military engagement. And last but not least, or perhaps more importantly, think of the poor Balts. The Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians know full well that they are extremely vulnerable to potential Russian attack. It's been calculated by the RAND Corporation that Russia could seize all of Estonia in exactly 3 hours, which was pretty much the expectation Putin had when he invaded Ukraine. But this is actually real. This could actually happen. And imagine the following. Russia seizes parts or all of Estonia. Of course, it wouldn't do that in the form of an aggression. It would say that it's there to defend the sovereign rights of the oppressed Russian minority. That's been standard Russian operating procedure for the last 100 years. And how would NATO respond? Do you seriously think that the United States is going to send Marines to save Estonia? I am not at all certain that that would happen.
Yeah, that's an issue with the NATO enlargement debate. If you're going to include countries in the alliance, you have to be able to defend them. And I'm no military analyst, but it seems to me that it would be very difficult for NATO to defend the Baltic states. But not to digress about that potential war, although, of course, this is all related. But I do want to talk to you about the current war. But, I do tend to agree with you. This is a war between Russia and Ukraine. But as Michael Kimmage and others have convincingly argued, Putin is making it about a war against the West. And I think in that context is where we have to discuss the EU and NATO vis-a-vis Ukraine, right? He is globalizing the war when it comes to the food supply. So it does have implications for the rest of the world, and not just because the United States is funding Ukraine and rhetorically supporting Ukraine in this global battle versus autocrats. There are real implications here. And as far as real interests go, to your earlier point about Putin's miscalculations and all the reasons why it would make no sense for him to invade, well, we know that when states or leaders are assessing their interests, it's not just a cold, dispassionate calculation. Nationalism influences their view of what their interests should be. I guess that's why I always say when it comes to state interests, I say perceived state interests. And Alexander Motyl, that wasn't really a question I just asked you. It was more of a speech. But if you have anything to add to that before I dig down into the Donbas here with you.
I think the point you made is extremely important because there's a fairly influential tendency within the United States amongst academics, policy analysts, as well as policymakers. I mean, it's essentially called the realist school, that argues that behavior of states is essentially determined by a kind of balance of power calculation of interests. And the interests are generally reduced to survival, security, and the issues that seem to be of greatest importance are, the number of soldiers you have, the number of rockets, these sorts of things. And these people generally argue that, well, Putin was somehow fearful of NATO expansion. Ukraine was considered to be a potentially dangerous jump-off point for continued NATO expansion. This was a serious threat, and so on. I happen to belong to the view, or to the school that believes this is all balderdash. Putin's estimation of Ukraine, all right, has nothing to do and has never had anything to do with the actual reality of Ukraine's potential as a threat to Russia. All you need to do is look at the map. Russia is a country of 11 time zones. Ukraine is a country of 1 time zone. At the point of invasion in 2014, by the way, that's the beginning of the war, not 2022, Ukraine had all of 7,000 battle-ready troops. It had virtually no tanks because it spent the last decade and a half selling its tanks. In 1994, it abandoned all of its strategic and tactical nuclear missiles. There was no way that any kind of semi-rational individual would have perceived Ukraine as being a threat to Russia, a country of 145 million with thousands of nuclear weapons and an army of 1 million and so on. But given Putin's ideological predilections, and I'll call them very briefly, the term that I'll use is great power imperialism, all right, which goes back to the Russian Empire. I mean, this goes back to Peter the Great, if not to Ivan the Terrible. It was certainly alive and well, but in a somewhat different form during the Soviet Union. And it was revived and certainly energized by Putin when he came to power in 1999. Given his ideological lens, the threat is not Ukraine's potential membership in NATO. The threat to Russia consists in Ukraine's very existence as a separate nation and state, regardless of who's in charge. It doesn't matter that the president is Jewish. As you know from Putin's recent statement, he's just carrying out the wishes of his curators in the West, which is classical anti-Semitism, all right? So the very existence of this nation, the very existence of this state poses to Putin's somewhat deranged mind, and alas, to the deranged minds of many members of the Russian elite and population, a threat to Russia. And that's a very different ballgame. That has everything to do with the perceptions you were talking about and virtually nothing to do with the, quote, objective reality.
Yeah, I think as a realist, you have to be realistic, if you will, about the way ideology, nationalism influences the way people view the world, their interests, and also how they view the other side's moves, right? What is a defensive move to one side looks like an offensive move to the other. So now we've got to do something to defend ourselves against that. You know, I do think, and I want to get to the Donbas here, but you're raising so many excellent points. I do think NATO is a real issue, but I don't buy mono-causal explanations for what's going on here today. I think the NATO debate vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia has to take place in a larger context, and that is keeping Ukraine in Russia's orbit and trying to do that for as long as he could, and then realizing, you know what, now he's going to lose it, meaning Putin, and he's going to resort to a full-scale war to try to keep it. You brought up the fact that Ukraine's military wasn't ready in 2014. Why didn't Putin invade then? I guess we can get to that question in the next series of questions I intend to ask you. But if you'd like to respond to, again, another word salad. Sorry, Alexander, but go ahead.
No, that's a very good point. I remember mid-2014, I even wrote a number of pieces on that particular issue. Is why did Putin stop? The answer is I don't know. And of course, no one knows. It's pure speculation. My speculative answer would be that he figured this would be a piece of cake regardless of when he did it. Annexing Crimea and parts of the Donbas was sufficient for the present purposes. If he went further, that would probably alienate, aggravate relations with the West. Why bother? Since, after all, Ukraine didn't really exist. It was an artificial country, as you said on a number of occasions. And why not just wait a few more years and then do what he did in February 24th of 2022, invade in the expectations that within a few hours, Ukrainians would run out into the streets and greet Russian tanks with bread and salt. Putin has always had that notion about Ukraine, right? That these people aren't really Ukrainians. They're really Russians who've been befuddled into thinking that they're something else. So all he needs to do is give them a persuasive reason to believe that they're really Russian, and they'll jump at the opportunity with bread and salt. Now, if that's the case, if that's the mindset, if that's the starting point of your thinking about Ukraine, why expend additional energy in 2014? Why look like a bad guy? Why not just wait until whenever, in this case until 2022, march in and be greeted with hurrahs?
After spending the better part of a decade, quote unquote, modernizing your military too. So another reason why I thought it might have been a cakewalk. So in 2019, Vladimir Zelensky runs for president. He runs on a promise, does he not, to resolve the war in the East by negotiations. Was reintegration of the Donbas part of his approach, part of his platform?
That's been a standard sort of given for just about all Ukrainian leaders. The idea was that, Zelensky's propositions, or rather what made his promises to the people, were that he would go to Minsk, he would possibly go to Moscow, meet with Putin. All this sounds a bit like Donald Trump promising to solve the war in 24 hours. He would meet with Putin, meet with Lukashenko, negotiate, and then negotiate a ceasefire, which would eventually lead to some kind of permanent peace. The details were unclear. Right? It was just a bunch of promises that, unlike Poroshenko, who presumably hadn't tried hard enough, Zelensky would try hard enough and would be able to persuade Putin, given the power of his charm, given the power of his personality, to desist and come up with some kind of peace deal. Right? But the notion of giving up territory, that wasn't discussed. Now, again, maybe in his heart of hearts and behind the scenes, this is what Zelensky was talking about. But publicly, and certainly in the things that I read and I recall, that was never an issue. Ukrainian policymakers have always stood firmly on the belief that these territories have to be reintegrated into Ukraine. Indeed, that was also the premise of the Minsk Accords. Right.
What about autonomy for those? Was Minsk calling, sorry to interrupt, Professor Motyl, did Minsk call for autonomy for those provinces that would be part of a sovereign Ukraine but have an autonomous status?
It called for a certain kind of autonomy, but it was an autonomy that would have been premised on elections being held under Ukrainian sovereign supervision. All right, which meant, in other words, that from the Ukrainian point of view, they would only discuss issues of autonomy, rights, and so on, only after elections were held, and only after the Russians left the territories that they had occupied, so as to enable the Ukrainians, together with the international community, to hold the elections. And the Russians, in essence, were arguing, no, autonomy first, we maintain the occupation, and let's hold sort of elections in the meantime. So it was to some degree a procedural issue, but it was a procedural issue that obviously related to the fundamental disagreement of what Russia's role in these regions should be. Ukraine was essentially saying, you leave and we'll fix the problem. Russia was saying, you fix the problem and we'll stay. In effect, that's still the Russian attitude.
Yeah, I have a book here, Ukraine's Unnamed War, Before the Russian Invasion of 2022. So this is a recent book by Dominique Arel and Jesse Driscoll. They contend that the Ukrainian government refused to budge on the Minsk Accords, even when they were prodded to do so by Germany and France on the eve of 2022 invasion, so recently. In other words, there was intransigence on both sides, not just Russia. And in their telling, the Accords acknowledged that for the conflict to be resolved, political grievances of local Donbas actors had to be addressed before Russian troops relieve, to your point you just made here. But that was a concession that the no capitulation faction in Ukrainian politics would never agree to. Thoughts on that? I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, why did we miss this chance to resolve this situation before this horrible full-scale war broke out?
You referred to Ukrainian intransigence. Well, when your country's been invaded and 6 to 10% of the territory has been illegally annexed, and you insist on getting it back, I'm not exactly sure that intransigence is quite the right word to describe that kind of behavior. That just seems like a commonsensical approach. The real intransigence is on the part of the Russians, who were continually insisting on having some role in the region. The larger fear, and this is ultimately the obstacle, this was essentially what killed Minsk and is still the obstacle today, is what are Russia's overall intentions vis-a-vis Ukraine? If you think of the problem between Ukraine and Russia as being exclusively about autonomy, Russian rights, language in the Donbas, if that's all it is, then the issue could have been settled, if not immediately, then over time, given some concessions on the part of the Ukrainians and so on, and perhaps the Russians as well. But you see, it's not, and that's the problem.
It's not just about
the problem is It's about Ukraine. It's about Russia's wanting to dominate the entire country and transforming it into another Belarus, perhaps arguably even into a puppet state, a vassal state of Russia. And given that, and by the way, just about every Ukrainian, certainly within the political elite, within the political class, including Mr. Zelensky, I don't know if that's what he believed in 2019, but he's certainly come to believe that in the last 2 years. Virtually every Ukrainian will now tell you that's the problem. I happen to agree with them. And of course, there's so much evidence to suggest that that's the case. I mean, one goes back into history. There are the cultural and ideological views on the part of so many Russians, statements by Putin, and so on and so on and so forth.
Maybe intransigence is not the right word, but just to follow up on that, to cite again Dominique Arel and Jesse Driscoll here, their argument is that to ignore, again, this is their take, that to ignore the local roots of the conflict in Donbas helped generate the wrong policy prescriptions during much of 2015 to 2021 period. So they're arguing that these were local Donbas actors who ignited the separatist war, and then Moscow stepped in after the fact. In other words, the Kremlin did not start the separatist war in their view. And they say this is not to relativize the Russian violations of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So they're not making excuses. And they're saying they especially don't want to link Ukrainian or Western behavior to the unprovoked Russian invasion of 2022. They say their more modest goal is to explain why some opportunities for resolution were rejected by political actors in Kyiv and Moscow. But you know, this is all water under the bridge at this point.
It is water under the bridge, and not only that, it's extremely modest water under the bridge. Basically, they're saying that maybe, perhaps, under certain circumstances, if things had been just right, it's conceivable that conceivably the Ukrainians and the Russians, there are just so many ifs and so many conditions attached to this. And to think that a concession on the part of Kyiv with regard to the Donbas would have ameliorated circumstances and would have persuaded Putin to withdraw his forces, not just from the Donbas, by the way, but from the Crimea as well. Remember, those two issues are inextricably related because they were taking place at precisely the same time. To think that certain Ukrainian concessions vis-a-vis the Donbas would have persuaded Putin to withdraw, take his forces out of the Donbas and the Crimea, strikes me as the height of naivete.
Yeah, Russian troops have never left Moldova. They have not left Georgia, and that would be the Transnistria region of Moldova. Georgia, Chechnya is basically a puppet state. Belarus is a client state. The dismantling of the USSR, the wars of Soviet succession, Russian troops have a bad track record when it comes to going home. So in 2019, not long after Zelensky's election, you wrote, Ukrainians should consider the Russian occupation of Donbas as a godsend for their country. And the reason why I'm bringing up this article you wrote in 2019 is, if informed observers could see the Donbas as something that Ukrainians might be or should be willing to part with, then what sense does it make to fight a war of attrition for who knows how many years over the same territory? What did you mean by a godsend for their country?
Well, let me just add, before I answer that question, I actually wrote something like 4 or 5 articles making that precise point. And the first one, if I'm not mistaken, actually appeared in 2014.
Oh, all right.
Right. So I was pretty much playing the same tune for something like 5 years in a row. The point was very simple. The Donbas is a rust belt. So economically, it's really more of a drain on Ukraine's resources than anything else. The population of the Donbas at that point in time was overwhelmingly supportive of Yanukovych and Russia. It was certainly anti-Western. It was certainly anti-democratic. It was definitely anti-liberal. Economically, politically, it was just ballast. And my argument was from the start, who needs this? If you want to become Western and if you want to democratize, institute significant reforms along the idea, market reforms, democratic reforms, this particular region is just going to be an obstacle. they generally provided about 30% of the total vote would go to the pro-Soviet, pro-Russian leaders like Yanukovych. And precisely because of the fact that those parties that represented the Donbas would also have 30 to 40% of the seats in the parliament, that essentially meant that they could block anything. So my argument was, get rid of them. Who needs this? That made sense because I was working on the assumption that Russia would not be pursuing a full-scale war against Ukraine. I didn't even think, frankly, that it would be engaging in a military incursion to expand its control over the Donbas. I figured, okay, Putin has, aggressive designs. He's likely to pursue them politically, economically. Ukraine has experienced that. Belarus has, Kazakhstan, all of Russia's neighbors. They can manage somehow or other on their own, together with the support of some elements of the international community. So given the fact that my assumption was that Russia would be more or less non-aggressive, certainly in a military sense, it would be non-aggressive. What did this entail? Basically just kind of saying, you know what, keep it. They wouldn't even have to do that formally. All they could just say is, we're not interested. We're not going to try to regain control over the regions. We're just going to ignore it. We're just going to pretend it's not really part.
Well, they didn't have the money to reintegrate it anyway, right?
Well, there's that. It was calculated back then by Anders Aslund that would cost something like $20 to $30 billion to fix the Donbas economy. Why? First of all, Ukraine didn't have the money. And secondly, why would you want to do that since you're dealing with a population that is hostile anyway? Everything changed on February 24, 2022. This region, which is still a hellhole, but of course, it's a highly depopulated hellhole because something like 2.5 million, roughly 40% of the population, fled between 2014 and 2019. An additional 2-3 million have left. So it's a highly depopulated economic wasteland, political hellhole. The Russian army has devastated significant parts of it. In its protection of Russian speakers, it's been destroying the livelihoods of Russian speakers. So given the aggressive designs that Russia has on these territories and on Ukraine more generally, it just doesn't make any sense, right? It would be suicidal for Ukraine to say, we don't care about these territories. They have to, if only to create something in the nature of a buffer zone between Ukraine proper and Russia. Putin changed all that. Putin had the opportunity. This is why I'm personally persuaded that he is prone to serial errors. Putin could easily have had Ukraine in his pocket had he not supported Yanukovych, had he not engaged in his stupid activities in 2014 and 15, had he not invaded and annexed, had he not gotten involved in a full-scale war in 2022. There was every reason to think that a significant portion of the Ukrainian population would have remained indifferent to Ukrainian sovereignty, possibly even supportive of Russia. He ruined everything.
So
he transformed Ukraine from a potential friend, and a potential vassal into an unconditional enemy. And the people who hate him most are precisely the people who he's claiming to liberate, the Russian speakers.
So the East-West divide then has been destroyed in Ukrainian politics. Even people in the Donbas, ethnic Russians, are not interested in being part of Russia anymore. Well, he said 40% of them have left, but
obviously there are exceptions, but the overwhelming sense on the part of overwhelming majorities of Ukrainians, and we're talking about 90 to 95% of the population, according to public opinion surveys, they support Ukraine's sovereignty. They're unconditionally committed to retaining and regaining all of these territories that Russia has occupied. Ukrainians were overwhelmingly positive in their attitudes towards Russians over the last 28 or so years, regardless of what happened, regardless of crisis, of whichever crisis happened to affect the relations between both countries. About 90% of Ukrainians viewed Russia positively. That changed totally, right, from 90% to about 10% over the last 10, 15 months. Okay, and that's all due to Putin. He should have realized, and we should certainly appreciate that this is precisely what wars do, right? Wars alienate people. And even if you claim that you're a liberator, once you start destroying hospitals, schools, kindergartens, civilian populations, civilian infrastructure, that will not endear you to the local population. It never did, and it never will, and it does not.
That's a historic change because the Donbas has always had a large number of ethnic Russians, Russian language speakers. It has always had this fluid identity, right? I mean, to be a Ukrainian has always had a fluid definition, right? Maybe not so much since 1991, more of a Ukrainian nationalism has congealed, but...
You know, as with all nations, identities tend to change progressively over time. They acquire different elements. They lose certain components, right? I mean, this is true of the United States. It's true of every country in the world, of every nation. So the same is true of Ukraine. It's also the case that, you know, there are always regional and cultural differences between North and South, East and West, whether it's in Ukraine or in the case of the United States. I mean, we still think of the West as being somehow different from the East, and the North looks at the South as being somehow a strange element, right? So all these sorts of things are typical for nations throughout the world. And the same is true of Ukraine, and the same is true of Russia. But you are right in emphasizing that for a good portion of the last 30 years, if not for a good portion of the last 300 years, there was a certain ambivalence on the part of many people who inhabited Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia. Some were very much against, some were very much for, some were kind of wishy-washy in the middle. That's changed. All sorts of academic studies, a variety of public opinion surveys have shown beyond any reasonable doubt that the vast majority of Ukrainians, regardless of whether they live in the East, West, North, and South, view Ukraine as their country, view themselves as patriots, and view Russia as the enemy. You know, fortunately or not, depending on how you look at this, that is very much the consequence of the war and of Putin's imperial stupidity.
But there is a question, and maybe it's not the right question to ask right now, but, you know, the Donbas is still going to be a wreck when the war is over. To fight in a World War I style of attrition over piles of rubble in the Donbas, it just doesn't make any sense. But it's not as easy as saying just negotiate an end to the war. Both sides have to be willing to do that. And to your point, this is not just about the Donbas. Putin seems determined to try to win total victory of some kind, if not for the whole of Ukraine, a considerable portion of Ukraine beyond the Donbas region.
And I agree with you completely, because ultimately there are two issues here. One is the attitudes of Russia proper, Russia as, you know, its population, its elites, cultural, political elites, and their attitudes towards Russia's role in the world, which they often tend to see in terms of a kind of imperial great mother Russia role, and in terms of their attitudes towards Ukraine, which tend to be dismissive, and the rest. That is a problem. Russia has a problem with its political culture, and that needs to change. But the more immediate problem, at least in terms of the fighting that's taking place at the very moment, is Vladimir Putin. There is no chance of any kind of negotiated settlement, of any kind, as long as he is in power. He has vested all of his legitimacy and reputation in the war. If the war doesn't end in something resembling a victory, and again, Russians aren't all that stupid just to think that anything is just going to be painted as a victory. It has to be a victory. He loses control, he loses power. So Putin needs to go before anything can possibly happen at the negotiating table.
Well, he might be around for a while. I mean, he is in his early 70s, but I mean, he could live for another decade or more.
Well, if you listen to some Russian analysts, again, they're Democrats, liberals, they claim that he is actually very, very ill.
Oh, how would they know?
One of them, well, they claim to have insider information. They claim to have knowledge. They claim to have contacts with individuals who are close to Putin. At that point, you kind of take it or leave it. You either trust them or you don't. If they're right, then he may be on the verge of departing this world for the next one.
Yeah, the Russian succession issue. I mean, that's a real problem. There is no orderly succession there. And you could get somebody just as determined to see the war to a positive outcome as the current guy.
Possibly, but probably not.
No.
Because the one thing we can predict, again, it's hard to be able to predict, any outcome of a power struggle. It could be the good guys, the bad guys, the semi-good guys, the awful guys, who knows? But the one thing that we can predict with, I think, fairly good confidence is that in the aftermath of Putin's departure, whether physical or political, whether tomorrow or a year from now, there will be a vicious and bloody power struggle in the Kremlin. We've already seen hints of that in the Prigozhin affair, in the killing of Prigozhin, in the crackdown on the extreme right as well as on the left. Clearly, something is afoot in the Kremlin. And if and when Putin goes, and he's been the linchpin, he's been holding all of this together, there will be a vicious power struggle. And it's not clear to me that the bad guys will necessarily win. Given those circumstances, and if the Russian population is sufficiently fed up with the war, it's perfectly possible that the good guys or the not too terrible bad guys could actually come to power in the form of a coalition. That could potentially change everything, because it's likely that they would want peace, perhaps not unconditional, but nevertheless peace. It's likely that they would stop the military activities. And there's at least the possibility, if not the certainty, of some kind of movement away from Putin's authoritarianism, his fascist authoritarianism, to something resembling a semi-democratic political system.
Well, that would be wonderful if they can at least get a ceasefire out of all of this. Whether all Russian troops would agree to leaving voluntarily, I'm talking about areas of Ukraine, including Crimea, I mean, who knows? You mentioned the word fascism there. I want to return to the Donbas, the history there in a moment. But since you brought up fascism, this is another issue I've discussed with many of my guests who are experts on Russia, such as yourself. My view is that Putin is not a fascist. The Roger Griffin, Oxford historian, his definition of fascism includes a rebirth myth. He calls it palingenesis. At its mythic core, there would have to be a new Russia that Putin is calling for. I mean, there are some elements of fascism in there. But I don't see Putin as an ultra-nationalist populist. I don't see too much populism there, and I don't see his calls for a new Russia. Maybe I'm getting tangled up in definitions, but I don't view him as a fascist. I think he's a Russian statist, looking to reestablish Russian state power.
Well, let me start with the comment that Griffin's definition is just dreadful. When you have to look up a term like palingenesis in order to understand what he's talking about, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of the definition.
He's been on my show for long interviews discussing this, but go ahead, yeah.
But again, it's palingenetic hyper-nationalism.
Yes.
And again, I'm always wary of the word hyper, which means like what? So you've got like normal nationalists like Giuseppe Mazzini, and hyper-nationalists are people who drink a lot, who smoke a lot. I mean, what exactly is that? So, but that's another topic. I'm not, I don't want to go into the definitional quibbles that I have with Professor Griffin. But in terms of a new Russian, well, frankly, if there's anything that we know from the Putin regime, is his promise to build a new Russian state, is to return Russia to its rightful place in the sun, to make it great again. And he's drawn on all sorts of real and imagined interpretations of Russian and Soviet history in order to make that point. He's brought back Stalin, rehabilitated. He's rehabilitated Stalin. He's rehabilitated the white general Denikin. He's formed an alliance with the Orthodox Church. He talks about Russia as being this great, powerful country that would be modeled on him. That's one of the important factors that I see as being critical to any definition of fascism, namely that the leader present himself, create a cult of the personality, and present himself as either extremely wise and or as extremely young, virile, and vigorous. In Putin's case, it's both. Now, again, we can debate whether fascism is the appropriate term, but there's something more in Russia than mere authoritarianism. Authoritarianism at a simple basis or a simple level is usually just a bunch of faceless generals, right, wearing dark sunglasses. In his case, Putin is absolutely central to the regime. And he presents and projects a particular image of himself. And if you compare Putin and his regime to the fascists, namely Benito Mussolini, and if you just look at the photographs that these two guys propagate, they're always standing, they're bare-chested, they're swimming, they're engaging in all kinds of martial sports and other things like that. The image is so clearly Mussolini-esque. And the regime is so clearly Mussolini-esque. It's repressive, it's anti-democratic, it's clearly nationalist, it's obviously statist. Right, there's no question about that. I would say the burden of proof is on people who would argue that it's not fascist rather than the reverse. But that may be to recondite a discussion.
Yeah, well, I don't mind taking on that burden, although I'm not a scholar of fascism. However, I don't like it when I mangle a question. After having read so much about this stuff over the years, my view of fascism has been heavily influenced by my readings on the Third Reich and Ian Kershaw and Richard Evans. But, Nazism was one kind of fascism, and you might even say it was different than other fascist movements in some important respects. So just to give Roger Griffin his due, this is his actual one-sentence definition of fascism, because, again, I mangled it a bit. He says it is a political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultra-nationalism. And palingenetic refers to notions of national rebirth. So you've responded to that point about rebirth, that there is something of a new Russia in Putin's worldview. But, I don't see him mobilizing the public. He wants a quiescent public. He doesn't want to mobilize mass public.
If you look at Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, I mean, if you take these as being definitely fascist, right? Were Hitler and Mussolini genuinely interested in an active, mobilized population that would have a voice in the regime? Of course not. Of course not. They were interested in a very pacific, quiescent, and subordinate population. Hence the ideology, hence the propaganda, hence the violence, hence the secret police and everything else. The fact that they would actually bring people out into mass demonstrations is neither here nor there. Democrats do that, socialists do that. So what is critical, and here I disagree with Professor Griffin, again, not in terms, we already talked about one side of things. He reduces fascism to an ideology. I think of fascism as a political system, or if you prefer, a regime or something along those lines. So to me, the fascist ideology is secondary. It's really a question of the political system. And that political system has to have at least three components to qualify as fascist. It has to be authoritarian, which is to say non-democratic. All right. It could be totalitarian, but at the very least, it's authoritarian. It has to have a supreme leader. It's not, so in other words, you can't have a cabal, you can't have an oligarchy. And last but not least, this supreme leader has to, as I already suggested, project himself or conceivably herself as being either all wise or all vigorous. All right, so the macho patriarch is the ideal fascist leader. And you see that in Hitler's Germany, you see that in Mussolini's Italy, you see that in Russia, in Putin's Russia. By the way, you also see that in Kemal Atatürk's Turkey. All right, so this isn't just a very specific, it embraces a whole bunch of regimes or political systems that we are not necessarily inclined to view as fascist, but which upon reflection may actually have far more in common with the fascism of Mussolini than may strike us at first glance.
These are great points. It helps me better understand the Putin regime. Definitions aside, definitions are important, but we can't lose sight of what something actually is, whatever we might call it. So one final observation here about the Donbas. In 1993, there was a general strike in the Donbas. So this is just 2 years after less than 2 years after Ukraine's independence. And because at that point the Donbas was still so important to Ukraine's economy, the strike really hurt the nation's economy. and it became politicized. The elites in the Donbas challenged Kyiv in order to win concessions and make demands about recognition in their neck of the woods for the Russian language and for a kind of autonomy so they could nurture their geopolitical links with Russia. And again, I'll cite my sources here. This is from the book Ukraine's Unnamed War. Long story short, Leonid Kuchma, who spoke Russian, rides this tie to the presidency. Just shows you how important the Donbas was at the time. He defeats Leonid Kravchuk because Kuchma carries the votes from the East. I mean, is any of this relevant anymore?
Not really, because of the invasion, quite simply. So on the one hand, as I mentioned before, the region has become depopulated. You know, there's a question mark as to how many Ukrainians will return to Ukraine proper. As you know, several million are still abroad in various places. Other things being equal, the last place you'd probably want to go is the Donbas. However strong your emotional connections with the area might be, it's not clear to me people would want to live amidst ruins within an economy that virtually has no hopes for the future.
Yeah. What is the future of this region?
It strikes me as being decidedly bleak, regardless of who holds on to it. People aren't going to return soon. I mean, some obviously will. People who are older and have no other place to go. Conceivably, again, there might be a wave of investment, although I doubt it. I mean, if you're going to invest, you should probably invest in Ukraine proper. Why would you invest in a wasteland? So given all these factors, even if I'm exaggerating a bit, even if it's not going to be quite the wasteland that I imagine that it will be, its political clout has pretty much disappeared. The only clout that it has is if it remains occupied by Russian troops. All right, so it's no longer an indigenous clout, it becomes Russian clout. So as long as the Russian troops are within the Donbas will matter, for better or for worse. If the Russian troops leave, again, it'll still matter as a kind of buffer or barrier or something like that. But I'm not terribly optimistic about the future of the region.
Sometimes there are no good outcomes. We can talk about them on podcasts and in newspaper columns or whatever. But that is the story of war. Sometimes there are no good outcomes.
Very well put. Very, very well put.
Imagine if instead Russia had engaged in true diplomacy and worked with Ukraine and the international community to ensure its interests were protected. That would be better for Ukraine, but also better for Russia and better for the world, which is why we continue to press for this crisis to be resolved in a way that allows a sovereign and democratic Ukraine to determine its future and control its territory. Not because we want to isolate Russia, we don't, but because we want a strong Russia that's invested in working with us to strengthen the international system as a whole.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, speaking of bad outcomes, speaking of what might have been, it'll be the first in an occasional series of podcasts. What if? Counterfactuals. And the subject of this episode is going to be John Kennedy and Vietnam, and our guest will be the great Frederick Lobovall. That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.